case study. I'd like to call up Howard Schwarts with Toronto Hydroelectric Systems Limited. Howard is an icon in the hotel and the resort space, representing Toronto Hydro and their incentive programs. And Howard's going to share with us a couple of stories on some of the work that he's worked on with hotel owners and operators. Howard, come on up.
Hey everyone. So I'm Howard Schwarts. I've had an opportunity to meet a number of you, obviously, specifically working at Toronto Hydro as the key account consultant. And so I just wanted to give a bit of an overview around the conversations that I've been having and just to sort of bounce off some ideas around some of the potentials and where I might be able to look next. So just obviously, I'm personally from Toronto Hydro, but this obviously is beneficial for anyone outside of the region as well. There's some people in the back, obviously, say hi from Enbridge and Unigas. So if you're outside Toronto Hydro or even within, they're helpful. And sometimes you'll be outside of this area as well. I'm not sure if there are any other LDCs in the area, but I'd love if you could just put your hands up. Yeah, perfect. Do you want to just quickly say where you're from so that anyone from that area can find you after? Great. Perfect.
We're from Martin or Hydro, both energy efficiency advisors, so working with primarily our large customers on ways to find energy savings.
Great. So everyone here is here to help. Essentially, you can look at us as free cost consultants in terms of finding ways that you can help your building save money and help the ownership structure as well. So with that said, just to give some sort of sense around what we've been saving in terms of project numbers, the blue is the number of projects that are created. The orange is the number that have been closed off. There's typically a bit of a lag period to it as well. And the line that's going up is the cumulative cost savings that this sector has been seeing as well. So in the last few years, there's been some great numbers. And you can also see how busy this gets at the end of the year in terms of everyone putting in projects last minute in terms of finding some budget for this year and also looking to next year. So I've got a lot of work on my plate right now, but certainly let's keep those conversations going for this year and next. So with that said, everyone seems to have put up their own slides around what kind of projects there are. It feels a bit obligatory in terms of when there's slides afterwards, but essentially I just want to run through some of them. Essentially there's the lighting, which everyone's familiar with, and then it gets to be a bit more controls and heating and HVAC related, which we've gone through. And so essentially it just looks to find ways to basically use your energy consumption a little bit more wisely. So it doesn't have to be running full blast just because that's the way the system's set up. When there's few people in the room, you can adjust your HVAC or systems accordingly. So we'll go through a couple examples. I just want to quickly highlight a few that I thought were interesting and sort of still that opportunity to be able to capture. So all of these are real examples in terms of the projects that we've been working on. So an example would be back of house lighting. As you can see, this one I took it as an example where it's a turnkey solution. Essentially the idea being that you can switch over from T8s, which are in 24 hours, either garage or back of house, and switch it over to LEDs. And so you can see with incentives, the payback period is under a year. It's an incredible return on investment. And then the other thing is that we always talk about these additional benefits. So it's been mentioned before, but the biggest thing that I see in terms of lighting is that everyone is spending so much time on the maintenance piece of it too, and so it takes up a lot of your time, and it's not going to preventive maintenance or anything that's sort of useful around this. So anytime you have returns on investment of under a year, I always feel like 1 year sales cycle, 1 year cycle of next year, you've essentially put out the same amount of money, and the question is, do you have new fancy lights that save you going forward, or do you have the older ones that you're are constantly putting effort into? So that's that side. There's another one in terms of the pumps. So we've talked about VFDs, and that's a great opportunity. In some cases where you're looking, maybe you're having a harder time finding the capital for a more holistic solution, we can look at very specific examples where there's a PRV that's blocking the valve, and so essentially that's a great way to balance the flow rate. But it's kind of like having your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time in terms of how much energy you're using. So we've created a new program, and that's called Pump Saver. And so essentially we would look into whether we can offer you essentially a free VFD turnkey solution. Here's an example of one where absolutely no cost, $11,000 savings. So it's a great program. It's worth sort of calling us in and seeing if it's eligible. Otherwise, it's a good solution on your own as well, and we can provide incentives that way. So this is another example. This is a good one where it crosses over between the utilities and the gas side as well. So this is a demand control kitchen ventilation. Essentially, again, the idea being that as you have the kitchen hoods on, the first thing that goes on in the morning, last thing that goes off, and you have an opportunity to essentially slow it down at times where maybe the kitchen isn't in use. So from there, you've got project costs of about $40,000, incentives, that comes from both Toronto Hydro and Enbridge. And then you've got some great savings, so payback period is 2.5 years. You guys had put up one of those as well. It was 3 years, so there seems to be a number of projects that are in that general range. It's definitely worth looking at if you haven't at this point. Also, so you've got mini fridges. So I wanted to throw in a couple that were a bit unique and more around the room renovations that take place. And so everyone has a cycle around that. In this case, by switching out the mini fridges, if you choose an Energy Star version, there's actually incentives for it. So in this case, it's $20,000 cost, incentive $3,000, and there's savings associated with that with the prescriptive model. Shows that the annual savings is pretty strong, just around $10,000. And all of a sudden, a project that didn't look particularly interesting or special now has a payback period to it. So there's definitely some interesting opportunities in here that are worth exploring, and sort of ones that didn't necessarily know had incentives for it as well. And I think finally, so another one that we're looking at is heat pumps, and I think this is another really interesting one with a lot of potential. A lot of rooms have P-tax in them, and that uses electric heat, which is expensive. Heat pumps are a much more efficient version of heating the rooms. And so in this case, the example was the quotes came in at $180,000 for this 95 room for a turnkey. For heat pumps, it was just an extra $20,000. So we did some numbers to see how they might compare. And in this case, we'd be able to offer an incentive of $40,000. The additional savings would be, in this case, $16,500 a year. And so all of a sudden, again, this project that was seen as just this big cost outlay that needed to be done for guest experience and comfort had a value proposition to it that made it more interesting. It had a net present value. The increased NOI meant that all of a sudden, if the property would be sold, there was an increase in value to the property itself. And so, again, sort of finding opportunities in areas that might not necessarily see. So those are the 5 examples I just wanted to highlight essentially here, just as a constant reminder that we're here to help you with guest comfort and experience, and having our pulse on in terms of the new technologies and where we might be able to support you, and then focusing on that bottom line for you guys as well. So with that said, if there's any questions, otherwise.
Hey, Harold. Great presentation, by the way. I just noticed that you use different KPIs for different slides. So I'm just wondering, from a hotel perspective versus LDC perspective, what are the main KPIs that you use to just to choose if a project is a go-ahead or not?
It's a great question. I tried to align them with whatever the KPIs are that the individuals or the hotels are looking at. I find a lot of times it's net operating income or payback period. But that said, certainly there's other times where there's a different focus around it. So I usually will have a one-pager that will support a lot of these projects, and it'll have sort of 6 or 8 different KPIs associated with it, and you can sort of pick and choose which ones you find appropriate. But for these ones, I just wanted to highlight sort of what made sense for that particular project. But good question.
Thank you. All the examples that you gave are capital improvements that can be made to the buildings. I've seen a lot of good examples of rebalancing and recommissioning of buildings that have improved guest comfort and have a really good financial payback. Do you have any examples that you can share with us about recommissioning or rebalancing of ventilation systems and HVAC systems that might inspire that to be done in some of these existing hotels?
Yeah, great question. So not particularly offhand with numbers, but absolutely have seen a number of projects that where rebalancing makes sense, both in terms of whether it's hydronic or ventilation. That's actually a big area of savings that we've seen. So it's great to highlight for sure. Okay, great, thanks.